This is a true story of a young and daring con man who lies his way into becoming a rich and successful teacher, pilot, doctor, and lawyer. The movie begins with scenes of some detectives arguing, while standing outside of a prison in France in 1969. A FBI agent named Carl Hanratty asked the guards to let him visit his American prisoner there. After some discussion and arguments, the prison guards let him in to see the American prisoner named William Abignail. The jail superintendent lets Carl sit on a stool outside of his cell, and instructs him to communicate through the small hole. Carl sees Frank in a miserable health condition due to the cold. Frank begs him to help him, but Carl replies that he cannot fool him this time and knows his tricks now, so he will not take him anywhere away from the cell. Carl asks him to sit there and reads him some legal papers. Frank sits and listens for a while but falls afterward. Carl gets serious about Frank's health and asks the policeman to take him to the doctor immediately. They take him to the jail hospital where Frank tries to escape, but is eventually captured. Now from this, the story starts 6 years back, where Frank was sitting with his mom Paula and dad Frank Sr. This event was hosted by the Rotary Club New York in the honor of the notable achievers in the club. His dad was awarded a token of achievement among all the employees. Frank looks at his father with pride when his father calls his name for his support in that achievement. Senior admires him and his mother. After coming home, Senior tells his son the story of how he met his mother Paula in France. They all rejoice on this occasion of his award of achievement. The next morning, Frank Sr. wakes his son to go with him to go to the bank together. Frank Sr. tells Frank to wait for him in the car like a big businessman, while the manager opens the door for him to enter. He goes into the bank and questions the teller about lending some loans to him. The manager rejects his application for the loan, saying that he is currently being investigated for tax fraud by the government. Frank lies to the teller by telling him that his store is a landmark in New Rochelle, having customers from all over New York. But the teller refuses to give him a loan. When Senior fails to borrow money, they come back. The family had to move out of their home because of their lack of money and Frank Sr.'s tax fraud issues. They transfer to the new apartment. Frank Sr. wishes his son his 16th birthday and gifts him a checkbook. Frank surprises his son by opening an account in his name at a bank with $25 inside. The next moment, Frank's mother drops him at his new school. He was wearing his old school uniform coat. When he walks to find his class, one of the students bullies him. Somehow he makes his way to his classroom, and the same student remarks that he looks like a substitute French teacher. He got this spontaneous idea to pose as a substitute French teacher. He started teaching the class, and used this opportunity to humiliate the kid who bullied him back in the hallway. After some weeks, the principal calls his parents. He tells them that their kid Frank has been teaching a French class, being a substitute teacher there. Paula gets shocked hearing this, but he keeps on saying that their son has been lecturing the students, giving out the homework, attending the teacher-parent meeting, and planning the field trips for the class. A few days after that, Frank comes back home from the school and gets shocked to find his mother cheating. He sees his father's friend Jack leaving the bedroom with his mother. He gets dismayed seeing this relationship. She tries to keep him quiet with money. He then goes to his room and shuts the door. After some time, Frank Jr. comes home and sees a car outside of his home. He anxiously gets into the house and finds a hat and coat on the couch. He throws those things at a man coming from his mother's room. He lashes out at the man to stay away from him. The man calms him down and introduces himself to Frank. He tells him that he is Dick Kessner and an attorney. He takes him to the room and tries to explain to him that their parents are getting divorced. Her mother finally tells him that his grandmother arrived there to take him with her. The attorney hands him an official document, asking him to write the name of the parent he wants to live with after the divorce. He asks him to go to the kitchen and think thoroughly before making any decision. He urges him to come back with a decision. His dad interrupts and asks him politely to write down one name to get over this situation. Filled with emotion and confusion, Frank gets out of that room and runs straight to the train terminal in a panic. He goes to New York City. He finds an apartment, but his landlord kicks him off after 2 of his checks bounce. He requests him to let him stay a night, but the landlord refuses. Frank goes from hotel to hotel and tries different ideas to get his checks cashed in the bank. He forges his checkbook and he learns how to tamper with his checks to get his way, but he gets rejected by every bank he goes to. After being rejected multiple times, he happens to see a pilot and air hostesses on the road after coming from a bank. He follows them and envies the luxuries and fun they were having. The next moment, he goes to the Pan American office pretending to be an article writer from his school. The receptionist warmly welcomes him and forwards him to the director. The director tells him everything about the flight missions and requirements for becoming a commercial pilot. Lucky for him, the director gives him his expired license card to authenticate his article for the students. He takes advantage of this opportunistic moment and calls the purchasing line of Pan Am Airlines. He tells them that he is a co-pilot and in a hurry to fly to Paris, but his uniform has been lost in the hotel's laundry. He orders them to deliver a uniform to his address, but they forward him to their uniform supplier in New York. After getting the uniform for the supplier, he cashes his countless payroll checks in different banks. Frank accumulates hundreds of thousands of dollars through forged checks. One day he goes to a bank and asks his teller for a date. She tours him around the bank, informing him about the mechanism of cashing the checks. He goes to the auction one day and buys one of these machines, which will help him forge better checks to make more money. After some time, Frank was sitting with his father at a motel. And he surprised him with a gift of a brand new Cadillac. His father refuses to take it, saying that the government will confiscate it due to his tax and business problem. Frank Sr. promises to get the family back together. Now the story shifts back to FBI agent Carl Hanratty, who begins his search for the man named Frank after hearing about the problem of fraudulent checks in different banks. He reaches a motel in Miami and asks about the guests and is shocked to find out that Frank was still staying at the motel. He rushes to his room holding a gun in his hand and starts searching his room. After this, Frank appears from the bathroom. Despite his unbelievable intrusion, Frank looks at Carl in a poised, calm, and professional way. He threatens Frank to comply with his orders to surrender, but he tells him that he is not the only one looking for this man. Frank claims he is also hunting this man who is dealing in fraudulent checks too. He impersonates Agent Barry Allen from the Secret Service in order to trick Carl. Carl's suspicions are lowered, but still asks to see Frank's ID. Frank hands him his wallet, but just before Carl could open Frank's wallet, he directs him to the window, saying that his partner is apprehending the criminal already. This convinces Carl, and he eases up. At the same time, Frank picks up his gadgets and leaves while his wallet is still in Carl's hands. He slumps down on the bed and opens the wallet, and gets shocked again seeing the advertising cards in there. He was tricked by Frank. He abruptly gets up and looks out the window and sees Frank running on the street already. Carl goes back to his office and tells his fellow officer of this close encounter with Frank and then leaves the office angrily. The next day, Carl goes to a cafeteria for breakfast. A young waiter comes to fill a cup of coffee for him and happens to see his paper. He asks him if he's a fan of Barry Allen. This confuses Carl and calls him back to ask what he means. The waiter tells Carl that Barry Allen is the fictional superhero of the comic book The Flash. This is when Carl realizes that Frank is just a kid. With this new information, he tells his agents to get a list of every juvenile runaway in the city. Eventually, Carl and the FBI agents find Frank's mother, Paula. They all go to her house and interrogate her. Carl asks her about her report for her missing child Frank Jr. and his photo. She shows them a picture of her son from his yearbook. Now Carl identifies him and starts his mission to find him. In the next scene, Frank was having a party in his house and one of his friends tells him that his friend Lance Applebaum had an accident. He goes to the hospital to see him. There, he meets a young nurse named Brenda Strong. He starts to like her and claims to Brenda that he is a doctor who is looking for a job. At this moment he writes to his father that he's tired of running and wants to find someone to settle down with. Frank manages to forge documents from Harvard Medical School and becomes a doctor named Frank Connors. The in-charge appreciates his grades and offers him the position of supervisor in the emergency rooms. Days go on, and one day his cover was about to be revealed when he gets a call from the ER to attend to a patient. Dr. Harris and Dr. Ashland ask for his advice on the injury of the patient, but he makes his way out somehow. In the next scene, Carl goes to Frank Sr.'s apartment and asks him about his son. When Carl observes his made-up answers, he writes down his number to call him when he finds his son in trouble. While putting the card down, he sees a letter from his son. He writes down the sender's address immediately without being noticed. The next moment in the movie, Carl and his team go to the address he noted in Frank Sr.'s apartment. They found nothing but a medical degree on the wall. Meanwhile, Frank was meeting with Brenda's parents asking permission to marry their daughter. He surprises everyone there when he tells them that he went to Barclays Law School, the same school where her father went. After the dinner, Brenda's father asks Frank about who he really is. To this, Frank says, he is not a doctor, not a lawyer, and not an airline pilot. He said he is nothing really but a kid who's in love with your daughter. Brenda's father misinterprets this whole answer and agrees to give his daughter's hand to him. The next day he takes him to his office and offers a desk to start learning the law. He eventually passes the Louisiana board exam and begins practice with Brenda's father. In the next scene, Frank surprisingly meets his father in a bar and asks him how he is doing. He replies that he is now a government servant. Junior gives him an invitation letter for his engagement, but his father says that his mother Paula will not come there because she is already remarried. Frank Jr. gets upset there and leaves. It's Christmas Eve, and once again, Frank calls Carl. He tells him he wants a truce and he wants to stop running because he is going to marry. Carl then says that he does not have a choice except to catch him and his $4 million. He then greets him Merry Christmas and hangs up. Carl has his new lead when he realizes that Frank won't be changing his last name this time, since he's going to get married. It's the wedding night there, and Carl finds his way into Frank and Brenda's wedding party. When Frank sees Carl coming, he retreats to his room, and Brenda follows him. She finds him panicked and asks him, what's wrong with him? He finally tells her everything, shows her the money he took from the banks, and then gives her instructions to meet him after 2 days at the Miami airport. He bids her goodbye telling her his real name. Meanwhile, Carl enters the room but is too late. Frank waits for Brenda at the airport. Eventually, he finds her carrying her luggage. He gets excited to see her but becomes disappointed when he notices some FBI men following her, and waiting for him to show up. Now he thinks of a plan to get out of Miami. He poses as a pilot once more and calls a nearby school. He tells them about an internship program that he offers to 8 young women from their school. He gets his girls and gives them the steward's uniform. He then comes in the company of beautiful flight attendants, distracting the attention of the all-male security officers and escapes. He tricks them again and flies out of the country. 7 months pass, but Carl and his team still follow Frank. Carl goes to his supervisor's office and shows him the forged checks from different countries. He asks to be allowed to fly to Spain because he thinks Frank is there. His supervisor rejects him, saying that he could not catch him in America, so how can he catch him in Europe? While sitting alone, he realizes that all the retrieved checks look real. He goes to the experts and asks what kind of machine could produce that kind of check. The experts tell him that Germany, UK, and France all have those machines. When they say France, his mind clicks to the conversation with Paula, who said that his mother lives in a village in France. One of Carl's agents recalls the village name. After that, they all go to the village of Montrichard on Christmas Eve. He enters the check factory near a chapel and finds Frank producing checks on the rollers. Frank welcomes him and offers him. He tries to convince Frank to give up, telling him that there are dozens of French police officers outside of the building. Frank finally lets Carl take him, and is taken by the French police outside. Now the scenes shift back to them in 1969 in a plane, where Carl was taking Frank back to the US. Frank asks him to let him call his father when they land. Carl moves near to him sympathetically and tells him that his father has died trying to catch the train. He goes to the toilet in his grief and locks himself inside. Frank again escapes from the plane through the toilet stall. He hurriedly goes to where his mother and her new husband live. He finds out that they have moved on in their lives and had a 4-year-old daughter too. Carl goes there too and captures him. The court sentenced him to 12 years in a maximum security prison. Carl visits Frank every now and then in the prison. Carl and Frank discuss how Frank knows everything about fraudulent checks, and Carl mentions how there are still lots of check fraud going on. Carl goes back and convinces his officer to come with him to meet Frank. Carl gives Frank a test and gives him a check to identify if it's real or fake. He instantly recognizes that it was a fake check. He then gives him the offer to serve the rest of his sentence working for the FBI in the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. He agrees and starts work in the FBI office. Carl welcomes him into the office while the other employees put their unsolved files on his table. After some time, it's the weekend in the office. Frank sees Carl busy with his family. So without having much to do, he again forges an ID of the pilot and tries to take a flight. Carl comes there and warns him that if he goes back to Europe, he will die in the worst prison in the world. He tells him that no one's chasing him anymore. If he's planning to go, he won't stop him because he knows he'll be back. The movie ends when Monday comes, and Carl anxiously waits for a meeting. But Frank hasn't shown up to the meeting. He eventually appears late and starts helping Carl with his new case.